Degree is a great equalizer between the have and have-nots.
Yeah, but it's not meant to give us skills. It's meant to give us the ability to think and acquire skills.
Yeah, but we value it.
We do value
So
it
that's
because it
this,
gives us the ability to acquire new skills.
but that's the saying
But then
that
you ain't graduating knowing how to do work.
no, but people think you are. So they value higher education and preparing people for the workplace.
Oh. I've never thought that higher education was supposed to prepare us for the workplace.
Good day. Thank you for watching The Mission and Mandate. I'm Cedric Thompson, the Workforce Evangelist. Today we will be having a conversation on workforce development and discussing the way in which we can ensure that there is more equity in the processes and in the systems and in the outcomes that we seek to reach. I'm joined today by my colleague, Iris Gill. I'm going to let her introduce herself and talk about what she does.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. I'm Iris Gill, and I am CEO and founder of Opportunity Consulting. And we work very squarely at the intersection of community, policy, and systems to create a more equitable world. Our focus is really on education and workforce development. And we also do some additional work in areas that intersect in those areas, like housing development and community engagement. So very happy to be here with you and have this conversation.
Thank you, thank you. Well, we're going to dive right in. And I heard you talk about working at the intersection of a number of things. So in the workforce development space, there are a number of places or a number of areas where there are intersections. Housing challenges, security threats, child care, you name it, it's there. And then across cities, there's also many, many opportunities, is what people would say, right? But when we look at it, we do have a system that perhaps is broken to some degree. There are inequities, there's a lot of disconnections, very hard to navigate, and these challenges don't make it easy to come out of generational poverty,
right,
or to create generational wealth.
Right.
What are your initial thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right. I think the people who have the knowledge and the information and know how to navigate the systems do very well, and rarely share that with the people who don't, and the people who don't rarely can find a way. There's either a mentor or someone who helped them, some door that opened, or some extraordinary circumstance that helps you create your own path. But I think the systems are designed that way.
Yep.
I think the American system has been designed that way, and when we look at the education system, when we look at the housing, when we look at workforce systems, we can recognize those patterns exist across them all.
Yep. So speaking of the U.S. system, I want to read some statistics.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So these are coming from the Jobs for the Future, JFF. Right? There are 180 million people who are in the workforce in this country. Okay? A little more than half of those people face systemic barriers to advancement and are in jobs that are not quality jobs, dead end jobs, like jobs that if you have to take a child to the doctor, you don't get paid.
Yeah.
There is no vacation time, there's no sick leave, there's no mental health day, right? So about 92 million people in this country, adults, are in those jobs,
Yep.
and they face systemic barriers. Currently, we have about 38 million people adults in this country who face systemic barriers to advancement, but they have a quality job. And they're comprised of people with degrees, people who are returning citizens, people who may have other risk factors, right? And so there is I would say 40 million it's probably about, let's see, when you think about about 40% of 180 million. So when we think about the universe of workers, about 40% of those workers are those who have systemic barriers, but who may have figured it out, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess I want to try to think about, how did they? Shoot, I'm probably one of those people.
I was thinking that too. I was thinking, you know, I went to college, not directly from high school. I took some time and figured it out and got through there. And I remember being a freshman and so many people telling me they were engineering majors. And I was thinking, why do so many people want to drive a train? So I had never heard of an engineer outside of what I saw in the cartoons, which was people driving trains with the engineer hat.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's just an example of career exposure. Mm-hmm, you know, mm-hmm. I'm a 20-year-old adult saying, I didn't know, so trains are, you know, our thing? Like, I didn't know that was the way of the future. But I think that's also part of what you're saying. Some people are able to get in and navigate. We had support. We had other ways that people poured into us. But, I mean, the challenges and the barriers start individually at a very basic level. It starts with our K-12 education, even before that. You know, so I mean, to me, that's a really good question. I think there's two things. One is the individual. What do you do to support the people? And one is the system.
Yes.
How do you transform systems so that norm isn't acceptable?
I mean, and what about the people who would say, but opportunities all around, folks just don't want them?
Those are the people who the system works for them, right? And that's that invisible knapsack of privilege that they carry with them that they don't know they have.
Yeah. I do some work in D.C., and I had some workforce development trainees on a previous show. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the vacancies, because every place you go, there's a vacancy, right? And so we went through, like, you know, here is, you know, this kind of a job. It's a receptionist job. Is that easy to get? No. You know, retail, is that easy to get? Yes. You know, you ask them, what about an entry-level computer science job? Because you have credentials. How easy is that to get into? Not easy. What about working in, you know, a fast food establishment? Easy.
Easy. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so basically, I feel like to this whole narrative about opportunity is right there in front of you. Yeah, for someone who has a sponsor. But if you don't have a sponsor, like, how do you even navigate toward that? How do you get an internship to give you the experience to walk into those jobs? And I think when we begin to look at this 92 million, it's probably full of people who don't necessarily have the access.
That's right.
And I brought up those previous guests because this show is about taking the voice of the community to the field. And these are people who have some post-secondary education. You know, they came to our training program. They got here on time every day and stuck it out the entire time. And, you know, they were able to communicate effectively and work as a team. And so I'm simply saying they apparently have some skills for an entry-level job that would be a career-changing job.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate that you're having direct conversations with the people most impacted, because that's where we need to learn on how to make these types of changes.
Yeah.
You know, that's, I mean, we're never going to get there with just a top-down approach.
Absolutely not. But here's the thing, talking about individuals, and this is coming from the Pew Research Center, and they did a report on American workforce and the changing job market. And they reported that most Americans, and when they say most Americans, they're talking about 72% of adults, believe that the individuals bear the responsibility of making sure they have the right skills and education to be successful in the work market. Now, what has been your experience? Because you hire people.
I mean, so what comes to mind for me is, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. said that it is cruel to tell the bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps, right? And so what that says to me is that that's exactly what we're still doing. We're telling people you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you should if you have boots and you have bootstraps. And what we have is a lot of people who don't have bootstraps, are just making it, have a lot of barriers in place. And, for me, as an employer in this city and in the field that we work in, I want exactly what you just said. I want people to come who are able to communicate well, who want to work and want to have a job and can come on time. And we can train them in many other ways and provide the skills that are specific to that job. So I actually think the employer does bear responsibility in supporting individuals. Not all of the responsibility.
That's right.
But if you're looking for people who come with a very specific skill set, you have to think about how to build that.
Yes.
How to cultivate
Yes.
that, how to provide those opportunities. But there's a mindset change too. You have to truly believe that the people in front of you can do the work.
Yes.
And that's where racism, sexism,
Yep.
Discrimination against people who may have things in their background that are unsavory, if you will. So there's a mindset shift that also needs to go on with employers to say the people in front of you not only deserve this, but could actually be the biggest asset in your job. Because they know what that community is about.
That's
they
right.
know what the needs are,
Yeah.
right? These are real people, and the more that we have a workforce that reflects the actual general population, the better our businesses are.
Yep.
That's a change of thinking.
It's definitely a change of thinking, and I've been doing this workforce development work for 6 years, 100% of the time. Prior to that, for like the 10 years prior, I was a part of it in career and technical education or adult education work, but I keep hearing the mismatch between like, oh, what employers say they need, and then perhaps what a jurisdiction is willing to provide training for, versus what people actually want to do. And so when you start thinking about how well systems are aligned, I think we have some challenges too in terms of like wanting to steer, the people at the bottom of the escalator toward jobs that others may not want to do. And so then that can sometimes turn into a revolving door. And are we then able to use resources efficiently? What I'm saying is there is no quick answer to solving this problem, but I do think we will need to figure out how to design systems that gives everyone, their fair opportunity to really succeed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think certainly the role of training programs that you're providing is a big part of this ecosystem and needs to be available to many more people. Then there's really at that system level, how are those systems communicating? We did some work a few years ago where it was focused on workforce, but a lot of people were coming with mental health issues. So how are all the systems talking to one another? How are they intersecting with one another? How are they supporting the person who's at the middle of all this, right? So the systems may work for themselves, but they're not working for the people who need them.
Yeah. Now, I'm using this term and I'm borrowing this from the education space. It's called coherence. And so I'm looking to, and I've started to bring together various aspects of workforce development so that we can start thinking about coherence, start thinking about how someone could get workforce development, mental health services, housing assistance, all in one like swell swoop. Because when you think about systems, many systems are designed to re-traumatize. So if I have trauma, I come get support, I tell it to this organization, then I get another referral for something else, and I tell my story all over again. And I'm in this cycle of being re-traumatized, and that's certainly not the way to go. But you've done work in jurisdictions.
Yes.
And you talked about work at the intersection of education and workforce. Any findings that you can recall that have just changed your mindset around some of this work?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. I've worked in a number of jurisdictions, and in a lot of our work, we go directly to those who are most impacted. So we've led a lot of focus groups and communities, and we've done a lot of interviews and surveys in communities, town hall meetings, and you oftentimes bring these findings of what people say they need, or when they start telling a story, and it brings to light the gaps that you see in the data. And you may take that back to leadership and say, we have a set of preliminary findings. And often what you hear from leadership is, oh, well, there's a reason we don't do that, or we used to do it like this and now we don't. And it's not what you're saying. How do we bring coherence to the system so it works for the person? And so one of the things that we've really started to say to people is, let's focus on the possible. Your hands are not tied. Mm-hmm. Right? Because the first thing they go to is why they can't do it, or why, as you just said, it's someone else's job. Yeah. Well, you need to send them to the Department of XYZ because they do, versus how do we think about this from a perspective of what does a person need? And oftentimes it is within their purview to do something, right? So that's become one of our top line approaches, is focus on the possible. Let's focus on what is possible. You can't cure poverty today, mm-hmm. but you can provide some workforce training for somebody, right? And we had a whole conversation in one jurisdiction where, and this is where the intersection happened, right? Where parents could not get their children to school because there was not a bus, and they had to walk up a treacherous hill in a very cold weathered climate, and just couldn't do it on some places and sometimes. And there was a shortage of bus drivers, but yet there were a lot of people who needed jobs. And what we were hearing was, well, these people do the training, and these people do the licensing, but it's really a school system issue when it comes to the budgeting and the buses, and so it just is impossible. But who was it impossible for? It wasn't impossible for the people who could afford cars.
That's right.
And who could drive their children to school.
Yes.
Right? So who was missing out in school?
Yeah, for the people who needed it the most.
For the people who needed it the most. The people who public education was really designed for. Newcomers to the country, people who don't know that they are allowed to ask for more oftentimes, people who are used to hearing no and being re-traumatized, so choose not to ask again, right? And so that's where taking a bold stance, and as a city saying, we will not allow a bus to prevent children from coming to school.
That's right.
Where that may be their meal a day.
That's right.
Where that may be 1 mile away. We will not allow that. And so we've got people who, in a focus group, I said, how many of you would be interested in learning to drive the bus? Everybody put their hands up. Okay? And yet we're creating barriers to things because of system issues.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Okay, so was it race related, or you think it was just like they were all the same race?
I mean, I think that it's always there. In America, it's always race related to some extent, right? Whether it's we as individuals feel that way, but that's how the system was designed. It's linked to poverty. It's linked to a lot of things. In this particular community, you had it was a refugee resettlement community. Okay. You had a lot of Black and brown people who came from other countries and were refugees and had come from places where they were escaping a really negative situation. So coming to America and living in high poverty and not being able to take a bus to school, to them was not the worst thing they've ever been through. So they were not willing to do the level of self-advocacy they likely would have needed to. Whereas you have
they may not have had the platform.
And they may not have had the platform, right? I mean, when you've got a community where you speak 60 different languages, and yet your school board meetings are in English, there's an access issue, right? So lots of things going on, and that's also system issues. You can make those changes happen, but it requires you to believe that those people deserve to have something.
Yeah, because in this day and time, language access, for example, is so easy. So that's definitely within your control.
Right, absolutely within the control.
No, I asked because in this city, in DC, the statistics in terms of income, white persons earn 284 times more than a Black person. So if a Black person makes $1,000 a year, on average, a white person makes $284,000. And
so the largest wealth gap in the country, largest Black-white wealth gap in the country, right here in the nation's capital.
But this place has good government jobs. So what's the problem?
What's the problem to create the wealth gap?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Washington, D.C. is an unusual place in that you don't have a low-income white community. Does not exist in the District of Columbia. It's probably the only state in the country that doesn't have low-income white people. And so that already creates a class division where white people automatically make money and are high income. And you do have a historic low-income black community in Washington, D.C. And that stratification has consisted of the same thing over many, many years and has persisted over time. And guess what? It works for the people it works for. There's no desire to necessarily change that, right? We have a city that offers a lot of jobs, you're right, and we have government jobs, and I think that those pay well. But when we're talking about the highest wealth gap in the country, we're talking about people who make a lot of money and are not paid on government jobs, right? When you're talking about that 284 times.
But it's generational wealth is really what it is.
It's persisted over many generations. And oftentimes we tell ourselves this is it. This is the best we're gonna get.
Yeah.
Right? And so how do we also help our communities aspire for more and build in those opportunities for higher heights that aren't generational bound? I mean, one thing that stands out to me, I don't know if you've read Stacey Abrams' book, she talks about how even we as people of color who have gone to the middle class oftentimes create barriers for others because we believe we got in that door and we're going to crack it open for the people we know. But hey, I can't take too many risks. I got here and I'm hanging on by a thread. And so the chance that I may be able to stay requires me to be a little bit of a gatekeeper. We've got to change that mindset too.
Yeah, because gatekeeping is definitely a strategy that brings about inequity.
It perpetuates it.
Yes.
And that also goes to how do we think about not just gatekeeping, but actually, as she says, pushing the door wide open, getting in, learning the system better than anybody else, hacking the system, and figuring out how to make it work for us. That's a whole different mindset.
So coherence, not to go back to that too deeply, but coherence is about hacking the system.
I love that.
Because what I know is, like, if we're going to get someplace, I think the African proverb says if you're going to go fast, then go alone. But if you're going to go far, then you have to go together. Yeah. And so that's my desire. Like, I stay up at night trying to figure out how do you get folks connected to quality jobs. I mean, and the reason, and I know, like, we've got to do something about this because the U.S. Department of Labor has been capturing unemployment data for 50 years.
Yep.
And the unemployment gap between whites and blacks has been the same. Black folks are unemployed 2 times more than white folks. And it can't be because they're lazy, because our ancestors built the whole country for free.
Right.
So we don't.
Well, that's the answer right there. It's anti-blackness that this country was built upon, and that has not changed. So you hit it on the mark with that. I mean, I love what you said about the coherence. A coherence framework is about hacking the system, and what goes into hacking that system is learning it so well.
Yes.
Right? So how do we become students of the system and know it so much better that we can hack it?
Yeah.
We can figure out how to create the change. And I started this by saying the system was designed that way. And that's why it exists, and that's why the inequities exist. But if we designed it that way, then we can redesign it.
We can redesign it.
Right?
Yes.
And so that's the possibility in thinking it through that way. It was designed this way. We can redesign it. We have to learn it. We have to hack it. We have to have the will to do it. We have to have the skill to do it.
Yep.
And I'm excited to hear about that work. I really am.
So, any other closing thoughts you want to add?
Well, first, let me just thank you for letting me be here today and having this really exciting conversation. I think just continue to go back to the need to continue to work together. We all have so many commonalities in what we are working on, what we want to do. 2 big pieces that are dear to me. One is always listening to and hearing from those who are most impacted. So Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley says those who are closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And I just so appreciate that the people on your show and the work that you're doing, it's not just about what can I do for people, but what can I do with people. I think that's key. And then the second is the idea of the coherence framework. How do you really develop systems that work for people that need it the most? And I think that's just really exciting. I'm going to continue to think over the idea of hacking, learning it, hacking it, and really expanding opportunities. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Do you want to shout out your company? Where can they find you?
Oh, you can find us at Opportunity Consulting, www.opportunityconsulting.com. We would love to work with your school system. We'd love to work with your municipality, and really kind of bring this exact thinking and framework to systems change at the level at which you're working. So thank you again.
Thank you all for tuning in today on another episode of the Mission and Mandate. We heard in terms of this conversation on making workforce development more equitable. If we are going to have an equitable workforce development system, the mandate is simple. We must redesign the system. The system has been designed around things like anti-Blackness. And so if we're going to have a system that works for people of color, we have to be willing to redesign it. And so in terms of redesigning a system, what we have learned is that there are a lot of disconnected pieces. And so if we're going to redesign a system, we must design a system that is coherent, that is aligned from start to finish, and that leads to the optimal outcome. And within that system, we must make sure that we can hear from the people who need to benefit from the system the most and use their experience and knowledge to actually redesign it.
Yeah.
Signing off with the mandate here, we need to redesign a system that amplifies the voices of those closest to the challenges, and we need to look at ways to make it more coherent and make sure that a system is aligned from start to finish that gets everyone to the optimal outcome, which is access to a quality job that can lead to a lifelong career. I'm Cedric Thompson, the Workforce Evangelist. Please tune in for the next episode.